You'll love the quiet retreat with garden walks. My daughter-in-law said her smile too wide, her voice too sweet. I was still holding the porcelain teacup she'd given me. The tea had gone cold. Steam no longer rose from the pale surface. My fingers trembled around it, though the air in the kitchen was warm. The words landed heavy. Quiet retreat. It wasn't a gift. It was exile. Through the window, winter light poured in, touching the edges of the table where we had once shared Thanksgiving pies and late night coffee. Now, that same table felt like a stage for my dismissal. It has garden walks, she repeated, pouring herself more coffee, not offering me any. And a library. You've always liked books. My son sat across from me, eyes on his phone. His thumbs moved, fast and detached. He didn't look up. I took a slow breath. The smell of burnt toast still lingered from breakfast. My heart was loud in my ears. I wanted to ask, is this really what you think I need? Instead, I said nothing. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. You can move in next week. I've already spoken to the director there. Her efficiency cut deeper than cruelty. This wasn't a conversation. It was an announcement. I set the teacup down. The soft click against the saucer sounded final. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the manila envelope on the counter. My name in bold black ink. I didn't remember seeing it before. It'll be good for you, she continued. More people your age. Less worry for us. Less worry. I had raised a son who now found me to be an inconvenience. The clock on the wall ticked, each second like a hammer to the ribs. This is my home, I thought. My name is still on the deed. But I didn't say it.
Not yet. Instead,
I let her words hang in the air, thick and choking. The smell of coffee grew bitter. My fingers curled against my palm. My mind drifted to the spring morning 25 years ago when we planted the lilac bush outside the back door. My husband, alive then, had insisted on digging the hole himself. I could still feel the cool earth on my hands, the sun on my back. We had built a life here. Every board, every nail chosen together. And now she wanted me gone. We'll help you pack, she offered, her tone bright as polished steel. My son still hadn't looked up. I pushed my chair back slowly. The legs scraped against the tile, a sound that made her blink.
I see,
I said. I walked to the counter, picked up the manila envelope. It was heavier than it looked.
Oh,
that's just some papers for you to sign, she said lightly. To make the transition smoother, I slid my finger under the flap. The paper inside was thick, official. I didn't pull it out. Not yet. Her eyes followed my hands. A flicker, quick, nervous, passed over her face. Then the smile returned. I tucked the envelope under my arm. The radiator hissed in the corner. Outside, bare branches swayed in the wind. My husband's wind chime clinked softly, a sound that once meant home. I reached for my coat from the hook by the door. Where are you going? She asked, her voice high now. I turned. For a walk in my own garden, I said. Her smile faltered. The envelope pressed against my ribs as I stepped outside. The cold air bit at my cheeks. I followed the path past the lilac bush, its branches bare but sturdy. My breath came in small clouds. At the far end of the yard, I paused. From here, the house looked smaller, like it belonged to someone else. I opened the envelope. The first line of the document made my vision sharpen. My pulse slowed, then quickened again. It wasn't about a quiet retreat at all. It was about ownership. And my name was missing. I closed the flap and stood still, the winter wind curling around my coat. They think I won't fight. I looked back at the house. The kitchen window glinted in the pale sun. Behind it, I saw her silhouette, moving quickly, speaking to someone I couldn't see. My fingers tightened around the envelope. Tomorrow, they would find my room empty. I was 15 the first time I learned how quiet a house can be after midnight. Dad's boots waited by the back door, two dark shapes on the mat. The furnace clicked, then sighed. Mom set a pie to cool and whispered, "Sleep now, Evie." I lay awake, listening to winter press its palm against the window. Years later, my night shifts smelled of antiseptic and laundry steam. I learned the map of the ICU by heart. The squeak of curtain rails. The beep that meant, not yet. The beep that meant, call the family. When the blizzard hit in '82, I walked 3 miles in rubber boots. I was 25 and every step said keep going. Folks needed me. I kept going for decades. Morning rounds. School lunches. Double shifts when flu season chewed through the ward. I stitched neighbor boy foreheads at my kitchen table under the good lamp. I sat with strangers as they crossed that thin, soft threshold I had learned to name without fear. I carried coffee upstairs for Tom when his knees ached. He'd say, "You're my lion heart, Iv," and I'd pretend not to be proud. Our house on East Dayton wore summer well, screen door slam, Hose on the lawn, chives in the garden. Sundays, Tom tuned the radio and we danced small in the kitchen, 2 steps left, 2 right, laughing when my hip hit a drawer. The window over the sink framed sun on Lake Monona. I salted tomatoes. He reached for the salt again. "You'll ruin us?" I'd scold. He grinned like a boy. Peter used to sit at the table, crumbs stuck to his elbows. He asked for one more story. Dragons. Doctors. Dogs who refused to heal. I told him stories until the kettle sighed its last breath. When he fell asleep on the couch, I carried him up, whispering, "Keep going, Evelyn." Years fold quickly when you look back. Parents leave first. Friends drift away, gentle as rowboats in tide. I stayed. I kept the charts straight. I learned new monitors, new codes to punch on doors that hummed like beehives. My hands remembered what mattered: warm washcloth, slow voice, touch that says, "I see you." We made it to retirement with coffee stains on the table and 2 chairs that groaned when anyone sat fast. Tom's laugh rasped by then. He still whistled in the morning. He whistled the day the doctor said the tumor was back. Through the first chemo. By the 3rd, he tapped the tray and said, "Play the nurse today, Iv, and lie to me kindly." I lied with love. "You look handsome." He did in a thinner, braver way. Grief crept in like lake fog. One afternoon he took off his wedding ring because his knuckle hurt. He put it in the blue dish by the stove. I stared at it for hours. After he passed, the house clicked and sighed like it had a fever. I folded his shirts. I talked to the silence. I learned to sleep on the cool side of the bed. Peter came with flowers and a list. Bank accounts, yard service. Rachel stood behind him and called it support. They did help. At first, I was grateful. Then meetings got shorter. Messages arrived later. On my birthday, Peter texted a balloon emoji. Rachel suggested a book club for older women who like gentle reads. That phrase made me laugh out loud in the fruit aisle. Gentle reads. As if I hadn't spent decades facing the hardest truths. Mother's Day, they gave me a scented candle that smelled like someone else's memory. I burned it anyway. The smoke curled in the sun and made the dining room look haunted. Sometimes I drove to the lakes just to watch the light change. Teenagers kicked a soccer ball. Men in neon shirts jogged past. I traced the white wake of a boat until it faded. That line on the water felt like my marriage, bright, then gone, but still there if you looked. The first small betrayal landed soft. Rachel asked for my login to order groceries. I said no. She smiled like I was a toddler clutching scissors. The second came folded in kindness. Let us handle things. Save your energy. I've spent a lifetime turning energy into mercy, I thought. But I kept my voice warm. I'm managing. The night the power flickered. I took the flashlight and sat by the window. Snow came slantwise under the street lamp. I could smell cold metal like the inside of a toolbox. I made tea on the gas flame and drank it sweet. I opened the quilt chest and found the deed to the Savannah house, yellowed and stubborn. My aunt's note looped, "For the day you must choose yourself." Tom would have teased me for crying over paper. "Choose yourself, lion heart," he'd say. The kettle clicked. The house exhaled. Somewhere, a branch cracked under ice. I keep the old ICU habits. I count pills and label dates on containers. I practice standing without using my hands. I walk the block at dusk. Neighbors wave. The air smells like wood smoke and dryer sheets. When the brochure came, I was slicing onions. Rachel's bracelets chimed as she set it down. Garden walks, shared rooms, community events. I could almost hear the chair exercise routine through the glossy paper. Peter avoided my eyes and asked if the basement dehumidifier still worked. I wiped my hands. "Does," I said. After they left, I put the brochure under the pie weights. The house settled. A draft slid under the door and lifted the corner of the flyer like a small, silly wing. I pressed it flat. I wrote a list instead. Keys, photos, the blue dish, the quilt, the deed. At dusk, I carried the trash out. The can lid rang. Across the street, Mrs. Hanley's porch light snapped on. She waved with her oven mitts still on. I waved back. When I came inside, the hall smelled briefly of cold rope and newsprint. I shut the door and leaned my back against it. The wood was cool and steady. People think turning points sound like thunder. Sometimes they sound like a zipper. The suitcase opened with a purr. I laid the quilt on top. Blue squares faded where Tom's feet had tugged it in sleep. I rolled socks, tucked the deed, slid the passport into the front pocket. I left space for the picture of us on the pier, the one where the wind made my hair look wild, and Tom said, "Good, keep it." I set an alarm for 4. I wrote a note for the table. "Enjoy the quiet," I wrote, underlining quiet once. Before bed, I stood at the sink and watched my reflection double in the glass. I lifted my chin like I told patients to do when they wanted one more steady breath. I breathed in. Out. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked like a metronome for a song I knew by heart. I turned off the light and let the house hold me for one last warm minute. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of brittle winter day when the air feels sharp enough to cut. I had promised Mrs. Henley across the street that I'd bring over my cinnamon rolls. The kitchen smelled warm, brown sugar, yeast, a little vanilla from the icing. I just set the tray down when the front door banged. Rachel breezed in first, her coat open, cheeks flushed from the cold. Peter followed, phone in hand, nodding at whatever he was reading. Behind them came two of Rachel's friends, the kind who wear boots without a scuff and carry mugs they don't intend to wash. "Whoa," one of them said, looking at the tray. "That's cozy," Rachel laughed. "Mom loves baking, keeps her busy." Her tone was light, but there was a little twist in it, the kind you only hear if you've spent a lifetime listening to what people don't say. I smiled anyway. "Would you like some? They're still warm." They took plates. I poured coffee. Rachel stayed standing, leaning against the counter like she owned the place. "You know," she said to her friends, "we've been talking about getting Mom somewhere more manageable. She's been rattling around this house like a ghost." The words landed like a slap. Manageable. Ghost. I kept my eyes on the coffee pot, watching the dark stream fill the cups. "This house is fine," I said. Rachel's laugh was quick. "Sure, for someone your age. But you're forgetting the falls. The time you locked yourself out, we just think it's safer." Her friend's eyebrows lifted, as if they'd been handed a piece of gossip. Peter stayed by the doorway, scrolling, thumb moving steady. I set a cup in front of Rachel. "I appreciate your concern," I said, even though my voice felt tight in my throat. She shrugged. "It's not just concern, Mom. We can't keep dropping everything when you call about little things. There's a limit. A limit." My fingers curled around the edge of the counter. I'd been the limitless one for decades. Night shifts, sick days, emergency pickups. Never once did I count the hours or weigh the cost. Mrs. Henley's rolls sat cooling on the counter, their glaze catching the light. I thought about the time I'd sat with Rachel after her miscarriage, making tea, saying nothing because words wouldn't help. I thought about the way Peter had leaned on me when the bank almost foreclosed on their first house. Rachel took a bite of her roll and spoke with her mouth half full. "Besides, it's not like you're running marathons. You need structure." Her friends laughed, not mean exactly, but not kindly either. A small, polite laugh that said they were in on something I wasn't. The kettle began to whistle, a thin sound under the talk. I poured hot water into my own mug, letting the steam rise between us. "Structure," I repeated. Peter finally looked up. "She just means you'd have activities, people to talk to." "I have people to talk to," I said. The words were quiet, but the room stilled for a moment. Rachel broke it with a bright voice. "Anyway, it's all in the brochure." She reached into her bag, pulled out another glossy sheet, and slid it across the counter. Garden walks, shared rooms, the same smiling couple under the trellis. I didn't touch it. "Leave it there," I said. Her friends sipped their coffee, eyes darting between us. Peter checked his phone again. I wanted to tell them about the night shifts, the storms, the times I'd driven through ice to be at their door. I wanted to remind them that this house had been the safe harbor when everything else failed. But my voice stayed in my chest. Rachel was still talking. About meal plans. About how would all feel better? She said. Well, like I was a piece of furniture they had to move together. I took the brochure and slid it under the tray of rolls. "You should take some for the road," I said, my smile fixed. They left an hour later carrying the rolls. The front door closed and the house exhaled. I washed the mugs, one by one, the water hot enough to sting. Outside, the wind pushed snow into small drifts along the walk. The living room clock ticked, a steady, indifferent sound. I sat at the table and looked at the glossy corner of the brochure peeking out. Garden walks, shared rooms, manageable. The words echoed until they didn't sound like English anymore. Just shapes, just noise. That night I lay in bed listening to the furnace. The insult was small enough to hide under polite smiles, but it had sharp edges. It would cut again if I let it. I turned out the light. In the dark, I thought of Tom's voice. "Choose yourself, Lionheart." I was starting to think I might. It started with a knock that sounded too polite for a winter morning. I was still in my robe, coffee half drunk, when Peter and Rachel stepped in. They didn't take off their coats. Rachel's leather gloves stayed on, fingers tapping the folder she carried. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," Peter said, glancing at the kitchen like he was checking for witnesses. Rachel set the folder on the table. "We just need a few signatures, Mom. Routine stuff." Routine. I've learned that word can hide a great deal. I pulled my robe tighter and sat down. "What kind of stuff?" "Bank forms," Rachel said brightly. "They're updating contact info, making sure everything is in order in case something happens." I looked at Peter. His eyes slid away. The folder lay between us like a sealed secret. I reached for it. Inside were 3 forms, each with my name in neat black print. But the lines they wanted me to sign were buried halfway down, under sentences about joint access and transaction authority. "Who prepared these?" I asked. Rachel's smile was a little too quick. "The bank. It's just a formality." The kitchen smelled faintly of toast and cold air. I turned a page. One form had an account number I didn't recognize. The balance printed at the top was less than it should have been. My pulse beat slow and steady in my ears. "Why does this list you as primary?" I asked. Rachel didn't blink. "Because we're helping you manage things. You've said the online banking was a hassle." I remembered saying no such thing. "I manage just fine." Peter cleared his throat. "Mum, it's just easier for us to keep an eye on things." "No surprises." "No surprises." I thought of the brochure under the pie weights, the one promising garden walks. I thought of Rachel's friends sipping coffee while she called me a ghost in my own home. "I'll need time to read these," I said. Rachel's gloves tapped the table. "Of course. But the sooner we get this done, the better. There's a window before the rates change." I slid the forms back into the folder and closed it. "I'll call the bank myself." For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Peter shifted, his coat creaking. Rachel's smile thinned. "All right, but don't wait too long." They left with polite goodbyes that landed like cold coins in my palm. That afternoon, I drove to the branch downtown. The teller was a young man with kind eyes and a nervous way of speaking. He printed my account history. That's when I saw them, withdrawals in neat, regular amounts, each marked, authorized online. Transfers to the number I'd seen on the form. "Can you tell me who's on this account?" I asked. He hesitated. "I'll have to get the manager." The manager was brisk, efficient, and just cautious enough not to say more than necessary, but her eyes told me enough when I asked if Rachel's name appeared anywhere. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. I thanked her, folded the papers, and walked out into the cold. The air bit at my cheeks. Traffic hissed along East Washington. I stood there a moment, feeling the wind cut through my coat, and thought of every shift I'd worked, every dollar I'd saved, every bill I'd paid on time. Back home, I laid the statements on the table. Numbers can be cruel in their honesty. The total missing wasn't catastrophic, yet, but it was enough to prove intent. I didn't call Peter. I didn't confront Rachel. Instead, I took out my old nurse's notebook, the one with the leather cover Tom had given me. I began a new section: date, amount, method, notes. At 4, the light turned gold on the snow outside. I made tea, the steam curling in the late sun. I thought about Tom, about the time he caught a contractor padding a bill and handled it with quiet precision. "Never show your whole hand, if," he'd said. "Just know the cards better than anyone else." I would know the cards, every one of them. The next morning, I visited the safe deposit box I kept in my own name. Inside was the deed to the Savannah house, a few savings bonds, and a letter from my aunt. I added the bank statements in my notebook. The pen felt steady in my hand. When I left the vault, the marble floor echoed under my shoes. I carried no folder, no papers, just the weight of a plan settling into place. That evening, Rachel called. "Any luck with those forms?" "I'm still reviewing," I said. She laughed lightly. "You're thorough." "I am," I said. "Always have been." I could almost hear her recalculating on the other end. "Well, let us know if you need help." "I will," I said, knowing I wouldn't. After we hung up, I looked around the kitchen. The kettle, the clock, the blue dish by the stove. Each a small claim, a piece of the life I had built without their permission. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the walkway in a fresh, clean sheet. I let it pile. Sometimes you don't clear the path right away. Sometimes you let the snow hide your tracks. The first real snow of December came on a Friday night. By morning, the neighborhood was dressed in white, roofs and hedges softened under a thick quilt. Somewhere down the street, a radio played carols through an open garage door. The air smelled faintly of pine and chimney smoke. Inside my house, the silence felt larger than the rooms. I made coffee, the steam curling in the cold kitchen light, and checked my phone. One message from Emily. A photo of her cat under the tree, lights tangled in its whiskers. No word from Peter, nothing from Rachel. It had been 3 weeks since the folder of bank forms. Invitations had stopped arriving, subtle at first. We'll call you. When I offered to host Sunday dinner, a vague plans are still up in the air. When I asked about Christmas Eve, then nothing at all. I told myself they were busy work. Friends. The season. But the truth had a shape. I recognized that I was being set aside, like a dish no one reached for anymore. On Saturday, I saw them through the frosted glass of the cafe on Main. Rachel's laugh carried through the door as someone came out. They sat with 2 friends, mugs steaming, shopping bags at their feet. Peter saw me across the street. He lifted a hand, half wave, half apology, and then looked away. I kept walking. At home, I tried baking cinnamon, nutmeg, the sound of the mixer, things that used to draw people into the kitchen. The rolls cooled untouched. I wrapped them in foil and put them in the freezer. Emily stopped by that afternoon, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Thought you could use these?" she said, setting a bag of groceries on the counter. She talked about school, about her roommate's dog, about nothing and everything. Her presence filled the air with a warmth I'd been missing. "You don't have to fuss over me," I told her. She shrugged. "I like coming here. It smells like home." After she left, the house seemed to exhale, the rooms stretching back into quiet. I turned on the lamp in the living room and sat by the window. The snow was still falling, flakes catching in the glow of the street lamp. Across the way, Mrs. Hanley's family arrived. Coats, hats, laughter spilling into the night. I thought of the years when Peter was small, the rush of boots through the door, Tom's voice calling out greetings, the table crowded with dishes. Now the table sat bare, polished and waiting. The days blurred. I found myself speaking less, even to the cashier at the market. Rachel's texts were short-clipped. "Busy today?"
We'll see.
Once, when I called, she let it ring through and sent a message. "Can't talk. In a meeting." I began to take longer walks just to hear footsteps on the pavement. The cold pinched my cheeks and the air tasted clean, but the return to the empty house always landed like a weight in my chest. One evening, I lit a fire in the hearth. The wood cracked and hissed. I poured tea and opened the notebook where I'd been tracking the withdrawals. The columns of numbers were precise, ordered, like the charts I used to keep at the hospital. Outside, a car slowed in front of the house, then drove on. The isolation wasn't loud, it was a slow drip, a steady erosion. Fewer calls, no shared meals, plans made without me. I realized they didn't need to say I was being left out. They just had to keep moving forward without offering me a place. Emily's visits became the small anchor I looked forward to. She'd bring a pie from the bakery, or a scarf she'd knitted, her chatter filling the gaps in the air. She never mentioned Rachel or Peter, and I didn't ask. One night, after she left, I stood in the doorway watching her taillights fade down the street. The snow had stopped, and the world felt held in a long, soft breath. I thought about the quilt in my suitcase, the passport in its pocket, the deed locked away. Isolation can make a person smaller if you let it. But I'd spent a lifetime making myself larger for others, covering shifts, holding hands, keeping the light on. Now, maybe it was time to keep it on for myself. I closed the door, set the lock, and let the quiet settle. Somewhere deep inside, the part of me Tom used to call lion heart stirred, stretching against the cold. Peter's 50th birthday fell on the first Saturday of March, a gray day with a stubborn drizzle that slicked the sidewalks and made the streetlights blur. The party was at the Lakeshore Club, a place I'd been to only once before years ago, when Tom's firm held a holiday banquet there. Back then, I'd worn a red dress and Tom had called me the best-looking woman in the room. This time, I wore my navy wool coat and a dress I'd mended twice. Emily picked me up, her little sedan smelling faintly of peppermint gum and wool. She chatted about the weather, about the view from her new office, but I could feel her watching me in the rearview mirror. She knew I'd hesitated to come. Inside, the club smelled of lemon polish and roast beef. The banquet room was warm, light from the chandeliers glinting off glassware. Tables were set with white linen and small arrangements of tulips. A banner read, "Happy 50th, Peter," in curling gold letters. I spotted him near the bar, laughing with a group of men from his office. Rachel was at the far side, dressed in a fitted green dress, her hair sleek, her smile wide for the cluster of women around her. Emily guided me to a table near the edge of the room. I'll get us drinks, she said, squeezing my hand. I watched the crowd. Peter's colleagues, Rachel's friends, a few distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. Conversations hummed, silverware chimed softly against china. I tried to settle in, to let the noise blur into a kind of comfort. Dinner was served, prime rib, potatoes, green beans. I ate slowly, listening to the small talk at our table. A man I didn't know asked if I lived nearby. Yes, I said. Just a few blocks from here. Oh, he said. So Rachel's right? You're practically at the retreat already? I looked at him. The retreat. He flushed. She said you were thinking of moving into some place with activities and all that. I set down my fork. That's news to me. Emily returned with water for me, wine for herself. She gave me a questioning look, but before I could answer, Rachel's voice rose from across the room. Mom, come up here? Everyone turned. I stood slowly, feeling dozens of eyes track me as I crossed the floor. Rachel had a microphone. We all know Mom's been having a little trouble keeping up with things lately, she said, her tone bright, almost playful. Laughter rippled through the room, the polite kind that says people aren't sure if they should be laughing at all. But she still managed to make Peter's favorite, her cinnamon rolls, for tonight. A waiter stepped forward with a tray piled high with rolls I'd baked for Emily last week, not for this party. I'd given half to her to take home. Now they sat under the bright lights, my recipe offered up like a quaint relic. Rachel grinned at me. Why don't you tell everyone your secret, Mom? How you keep busy these days? I felt the heat climb my neck. I read. I walk. I bake. She bakes, Rachel repeated into the microphone, her smile widening. And soon, she'll have even more time for that, once she's settled somewhere safe and structured. Isn't that right? A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone chuckled. I caught Peter's face. Tight smile, eyes darting to the floor. Emily moved to stand beside me, her hand light on my elbow. That's enough, Rachel, she said, not loudly but clear enough for those closest to hear. Rachel's laugh was a practiced thing. Oh, come on. We're just having fun. I thought of the bank forms, the missing money, the empty weeks. I looked at the faces. Some amused, some uncomfortable, most simply watching. No one spoke. I took the microphone from her. Thank you for the cinnamon rolls, I said evenly. They were made for someone I care about. I set the microphone back in its stand and walked toward the door. The room murmured behind me. Emily followed, but I paused at the coat check, glancing back. That's when I saw Rachel leaning close to a man in a dark suit. They spoke quickly, her hand resting on the folder he held. I caught a few words over the noise. Transfer before the end of the month. The man nodded, and Rachel slipped the folder into her bag. I took my coat from the attendant and stepped outside. The drizzle had turned to a fine mist, curling under the awning. Emily joined me, her eyes searching mine. You okay? I'm fine, I said. Did you drive? She nodded. We walked to the car in silence, our footsteps loud on the wet pavement. Back home? I hung up my coat and stood in the hallway, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The humiliation still burned, but under it, something steadier was taking shape. That brief glimpse of Rachel's exchange with the man in the suit, it was a thread, and I intended to follow it. Later, I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. I wrote March 3rd, Lakeshore Club, witnessed Rachel with unidentified mail, folder exchanged. Heard transfer before the end of the month. The pen felt heavy in my hand. I closed the book and looked out at the slick street, the reflection of the streetlight quivering in the puddles. Somewhere in the night, laughter drifted from the club. It sounded far away, as if it belonged to another world entirely. I poured tea, letting the steam rise and disappear. Public humiliation, I realized, is a kind of test. You can shrink under it, or you can let it sharpen you. I took a sip, the heat steadying me. There would be another chance to pull that thread. And when it came, I'd be ready. Rain tapped against the kitchen window the next morning, soft and steady, like a metronome counting out the hours I'd been awake. I sat at the table with my coffee going cold, the image of Rachel leaning toward that man at the Lakeshore Club replaying in my mind. His suit was dark, his hair thinning at the crown, his posture the kind of careful you see in people who deal with money. I started with what I knew, the folder. The words, transfer before the end of the month. The nod, Rachel slipping the folder into her bag, the way she didn't notice me watching. By 10, I was dressed and out the door. The drizzle had turned into a heavier rain, soaking the edges of my coat. I took the bus downtown, sitting near the back, my notebook in my lap. The bank where I'd kept my accounts for years sat on the corner of State and Main, all glass and brass, the kind of place that liked to look older than it was. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. I asked for the branch manager, a woman named Karen I'd met once before. She greeted me with a professional smile. "I need to identify someone?" I said, sliding a brief description across the desk. "I believe he was at the Lakeshore Club last night with my daughter-in-law." Karen glanced at the paper. "That sounds like Charles Denton. He handles private accounts." "Why do you ask?" "I think my accounts may have been discussed without my consent." But her expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. "I can't disclose client details, Mrs. Harper." "I understand," I said. "But I can review my own." She printed a list of recent actions. There, sandwiched between legitimate transactions, was a line that made my stomach knot. "Pre-transfer authorization request. Pending." The destination account number matched the one I'd seen on Rachel's form weeks ago. "I didn't request this," I said. Karen tapped the page. "Then you'll want to put a hold on it immediately." We did. She also gave me the public contact for Denton's office. I thanked her, tucked the papers into my bag, and stepped back into the rain. The next stop was the Lakeshore Club. I told the receptionist I'd left something behind after last night's event. She let me into the banquet room to look around. On the floor near where Rachel had stood, I spotted a small scrap of paper, half of a business card, damp from the carpet cleaner. The logo was for Denton's firm. On the back, in Rachel's handwriting, was a notey deed. "Savannah, sign 30s 20 p.m. Savannah, my aunt's old house." The deed locked in my safe deposit box. My pulse quickened. I slipped the card into my pocket. At home, I laid out the bank printout, the business card fragment, and my notes. The picture was forming. Rachel wasn't just skimming. She was positioning herself to take the Savannah property. That house had been in my family for 3 generations. Tom and I had agreed it would pass to Emily someday. I needed more. That evening, I called an old friend, Jim, who had worked as a clerk at the county recorder's office. "Can you check if there have been any title inquiries on the Savannah property?" I asked. He called back an hour later. 2, both in the last month. One from a law office downtown, Miller and Denton. The name clicked like a lock. Denton again, and Miller, likely his partner. The following day, I walked into Miller and Denton's office dressed in my best coat and scarf, looking every bit the polite, slightly forgetful retiree. "I'm here to pick up copies of the papers Rachel said she left for me," I told the receptionist, smiling as if we'd spoken before. She hesitated, then disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, she returned with a manila envelope. "Here you go." I thanked her, kept my pace steady until I reached the sidewalk, then ducked into the coffee shop on the corner. Inside the envelope were photocopies of transfer documents. One page stopped me cold. A deed transfer form with my name typed neatly and my signature at the bottom, except I had never signed it. The strokes were too smooth, the loops too perfect. Forged. I took photos of every page, tucking the originals back into the envelope. On the last page was a schedule, notary, 3:20 a.m., 3 days from now. I left the cafe and stood under the awning, the rain spattering on the pavement. Forgery was no longer suspicion. It was proof. My hand tightened around my phone. I could call the police. I could confront Peter. But Tom's voice echoed in my head. "Never show your whole hand? Know the cards." That night, I locked the photos and the card fragment in my safe deposit box, along with the bank statement. I started a new section in my notebook, forgery evidence. Under it, I listed dates, names, and the phrase pre-transfer authorization in block letters. The next morning, Emily stopped by. She noticed the papers on the table but didn't ask. Instead, she said, "You're quieter than usual." "I'm thinking," I said. She smiled faintly. "That's when you're at your most dangerous." I laughed softly, but my mind was already on 30-20. I would be there. I would see exactly how far Rachel and Denton were willing to go. And when the time came, I would have every card in my hand. Sleep didn't come easily after that day. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the streetlight casting a pale square of light across the quilt. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that forged signature, my name stolen in ink. By midnight, I gave up and went to the kitchen. The floor was cold under my bare feet. I brewed tea, the kettle's whistle breaking the stillness, and sat at the table with my notebook open. Rain ticked against the window, softer now, almost like it was whispering for me to keep going. I turned to the page where I'd written forgery evidence and began adding details, dates, times, Phrases I'd overheard, the card fragment, Denton's name, each line made the picture sharper, the stakes higher. Tom's voice came to me, clear as if he were leaning over my shoulder. You can't stop people from showing you who they are, Evie, but you can decide what you'll do with that truth. He'd been calm in the face of every crisis, methodical. I had tried to carry that forward, but somewhere in the years after he passed, I'd let others decide for me. That ended now. At 2 a.m., I pulled out a folder from the sideboard, old insurance papers, the will Tom and I had drawn up, the deed to Savannah. I studied the signature lines, the way my hand naturally looped letters. The forgery was good, but it wasn't mine. I knew it, and so would a handwriting expert. I made a list of what I needed. 1. Secure all my legal documents. 2. Freeze any accounts Denton might touch. 3. Identify the notary scheduled for 30/24. Prepare a witness. By dawn, the tea had gone cold and the list was 3 pages long. I closed the notebook and stepped out onto the porch. The air was damp, the kind that clings to your hair, and the street was hushed. Somewhere a dog barked once, then stopped. The next day, I went to the bank to move the Savannah deed into a private safe deposit box at a different branch. Karen didn't ask why, but she slid the box across the counter with a knowing look. "Keep this key somewhere safe," she said. I walked out feeling lighter, but only slightly. Rachel was still moving toward that notary appointment, still confident she'd walk away with what wasn't hers. That night, sleep eluded me again. I sat in the living room, the fire casting flickers on the walls. I thought about the years I'd kept this family together. Double shifts at the hospital, cooking meals when I could barely keep my eyes open, driving Peter to every practice and recital. And now I was being erased from my own story. Emily stopped by the following afternoon with a pie. "You look tired," she said, setting it on the counter. "I'm fine," I told her, but she didn't buy it. She poured coffee for us both. "You're working on something?" she said. "I can see it." I hesitated, then slid the forged deed across the table. "They think this will work." She stared at the paper, her jaw tightening. "That's not your signature." "No," I said. "And I'm going to prove it." Emily leaned back. "What do you need me to do?" Her question caught me off guard. I hadn't planned to involve her, but the idea of having someone I could trust, a witness, an ally, shifted something in my chest. "For now, just be there on the 20th. And if I ask you to speak, tell them what you've seen." She nodded. "Done." The nights that followed were the same, long, silent hours broken only by the sound of my pen moving across paper. I began drafting a statement, careful to note that I had never met the notary, never signed any such transfer. I called an old colleague from the hospital who now worked in legal mediation. He agreed to meet for coffee and look over my evidence. By the time the week was out, the plan was forming into something solid. I'd let them walk right into that appointment, confident and sure, and then with every document, every date, and every witness in place, I'd stop them cold. On the eve of the 20th, I stood at the window, watching the wind push bare branches against the glass. My house was quiet, but inside me something steady had taken root. The part of me Tom called Lionheart was awake now, pacing in the dark, waiting for the door to open. The morning after my long night at the window, I woke with the same clarity I'd felt in the last moments before a tough surgery. You don't rush. You move with purpose, one step at a time. That's how you keep control. I started with the accounts. At the bank, Karen walked me through transferring the bulk of my savings into a new account under a trust name Rachel didn't know existed. The Savannah property deed was already safe in a different branch's deposit box, but I added copies of every important document. Insurance policies, my will, Tom's pension statements. If Rachel ever set foot in my old branch, she'd find nothing but dust. Next, I called Jim, my friend from the recorder's office. "Can you put an alert on any activity related to the Savannah property?" I asked. "I need to know the second someone tries to touch it." "You'll get a call before the ink dries," he promised. Back home, I dug through the hall closet until I found the old lockbox Tom had used for fishing licenses. I cleaned it out and used it to store a second set of document copies. Then I slid it under the floorboards in my bedroom, a hiding place I'd once used for Christmas gifts when Peter was little. Midweek, I visited the county notary's office under the pretense of renewing my own documents. The clerk was chatty, and between questions about her grandkids, I asked, "You wouldn't happen to know who's on the schedule for March 20th, would you?" She pulled up the list. "Looks like Notary Robbins at 10 a.m., Conference Room 3. That was my window. I thanked her, left, and immediately wrote Robins's name in my notebook. Each evening, Emily stopped by. Sometimes she brought groceries, sometimes just herself. She didn't press for details, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes. Finally, I told her about the appointment, the plan to show up with proof. What if they try to reschedule? She asked. They won't, I said. They think I'm asleep at the wheel. They'll want this done before I have a chance to notice. In the days leading up, I kept my movements predictable. Walks in the neighborhood, a trip to the library, a few hours in the garden, even though the soil was still cold. If Rachel or Peter were watching, I wanted them to see nothing unusual. Behind that mask of routine, I built my case. The forged deed, the bank's pre-transfer request, the card fragment from Denton's firm, a statement from Jim about the recent title inquiries. Even Karen had agreed to sign a brief note confirming my presence when the bank hold was placed. On Friday, I made copies of everything and sealed them in 2 envelopes, one for my safe deposit box, one for Emily to keep. If anything happens, I told her, you take this straight to the police. She took it without hesitation. The weekend was quiet. Too quiet. I didn't hear from Peter. Rachel didn't text. On Sunday evening, I stood at the kitchen window, watching the light fade over the street. The silence felt like the deep breath before a storm. On Monday morning, I dressed carefully. Charcoal slacks, a cream blouse, the navy coat Tom had once said made me look like I meant business. I packed my notebook, the original documents, and the copies into a leather portfolio. At 9:30, Emily pulled up outside. Ready, she asked. As I'll ever be. I said. We drove in silence, the wipers brushing away a light drizzle. My mind was calm, focused. I thought of it like threading a needle, steady hands, no wasted motion. At the county building, we walked to conference room 3. Through the glass panel, I saw Rachel and Denton already inside. Denton had the folder open, papers neatly stacked. Rachel was smiling, her hand resting casually on the table. They didn't see us at first, Robbins. The notary did. She stood, smoothing her skirt. Mrs. Harper? She asked. That's right, I said. I'm here for the 10 o'clock. Rachel's head snapped up. Mum, what are you doing here? Making sure my signature stays where it belongs, I said. I stepped inside, Emily close behind, and set the portfolio on the table. Before we start, I told Robbins, you should see these. I laid out the forged deed, the bank statement, the card fragment, the witness notes. This is an attempt to transfer property without the owner's consent. The room went still. Robbins glanced at Rachel, then at Denton, then back to me. If that's the case, we can't proceed. Rachel's face flushed deep red. This is ridiculous. Is it? I asked, tapping the forged signature. Because that's not my hand, and I have the originals to prove it. Denton began gathering his papers, his expression tight. We'll reschedule, he said. You won't, I replied, and if either of you tries again, these copies go straight to law enforcement. Robbins cleared her throat. I'll be making a note of this incident. Rachel grabbed her bag and swept past me, the scent of her perfume sharp in the air. Denton followed without a word. When they were gone, Robbins looked at me. You handled that well. I smiled faintly. I've had practice. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, and a weak sun broke through the clouds. Emily squeezed my arm. That was quiet, but devastating. That's the point, I said. No shouting, no scene, just the truth, laid out where everyone can see it. As we walked to the car, I felt the first real breath of relief in weeks. The plan had worked. But I knew Rachel wouldn't lick her wounds for long. Quiet justice had its place, but I wasn't done yet. Peter called 2 days later, his voice clipped. We're having a family meeting. My place. 7 o'clock. Be there? He didn't ask. He commanded, just like Rachel had taught him. I arrived 5 minutes early. Their living room smelled faintly of cinnamon candles, but the air was tight, the way it gets before a thunderstorm. Rachel sat at one end of the sofa, legs crossed, a thin smile playing at her lips. Peter stood by the mantel, arms folded. Emily was already there, perched on the edge of a chair like she wasn't sure if she was a guest or an intruder. She caught my eye, a silent question passing between us. I nodded once. Peter gestured toward the armchair opposite Rachel. Sit. We need to clear the air. Rachel leaned forward. This crusade of yours? It's exhausting. You've been making baseless accusations, involving strangers, and frankly, you're embarrassing the family. I didn't answer. I just let the silence sit between us until she shifted in her seat. Peter tried again. Mom, you need to understand that some of your responsibilities are too much for you now. Rachel and I? You mean the property in Savannah? I said softly. His jaw tightened. We're talking about the bigger picture. I folded my hands in my lap. Go ahead. Tell me the bigger picture. Rachel's voice took on that syrupy tone she used with people she thought were beneath her. You've done so much for this family, Evelyn, but it's time to step back and let us handle things. For your own good. For my own good, I repeated, tasting the words. She nodded. Exactly. I reached into my bag and set a small leather case on the coffee table. Inside was a single flash drive and a slim folder. I didn't push it toward them. Not yet. I just let it rest there, an unspoken weight between us. Rachel glanced at it. What's that? Something for later? I said. You were saying? Peter shifted, uneasy now. Mom, I held up a hand. No, please. Finish telling me why taking my property, forging my signature, and lying to a notary is for my own good. Rachel's face froze, the practiced smile slipping. That's ridiculous. Is it? I asked. My tone stayed level, but the air in the room changed. Emily leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked on me. I let the pause stretch, the case still untouched on the table. When you're ready, I said, we'll open this. And then we'll see whose good we're really talking about. Peter's arms dropped from his chest. Mom, what are you talking about? I leaned back in the chair, steadying my breath the way I used to before delivering bad news to patients' families. I'm talking about proof that every word I've said isn't just an accusation. Rachel laughed, too sharp to be real. You're making a fool of yourself. I reached down, unzipped the leather case, and slid the folder onto the table. The flash drive followed. Inside here, I said, her copies of every document tied to the Savannah property in the last 2 months, including one with my forged signature. Peter didn't move, but his eyes flicked to Rachel. She kept her chin high. Anyone could claim that. I opened the folder. The forged deed lay on top, a yellow sticky note marking the date it was created. I laid it out between us, then placed a certified copy of my actual signature beside it. Same name, same letters, different hand. I have a handwriting expert ready to testify. Peter glanced at the papers, then at me.
Why would Rachel? I cut him off.
Because Denton promised her it would be easy. Because she thought I'd be too tired, too distracted, too old to notice. Rachel's cheeks flushed. You don't know what you're talking about. I pulled the bank statement from the folder. Pre-transfer authorization. Destination account matching the one on your form. Karen from the bank signed a statement confirming I put a hold on it before you could move a cent. Peter's face was changing now, tight, uncertain. Emily's eyes never left his. And then, I continued, the title inquiries at the recorder's office, both from Miller and Denton, both within the last month. My friend Jim documented every detail. Rachel stood abruptly. This is insane. You're twisting. Sit down, Peter said quietly. His voice was different now, heavy. She stared at him, but he didn't repeat himself. Slowly, she lowered herself back onto the sofa. I slid the flash drive across the table toward Emily. Backup copies, bank, recorder's office, notary schedule. Even a note in Rachel's handwriting about signing on March 20th. Emily picked it up, her thumb brushing the metal. I've seen that note, she said. I was there when she wrote it. The room went still. I leaned forward, resting my hands on my knees. You wanted to clear the air. This is me, clearing it. You both tried to steal from me. And you failed. Rachel's gaze darted to Peter, searching for an ally. But he was looking at the papers, his jaw tight, his silence louder than anything I could have said. Rachel's voice came out low, almost a hiss. You think this makes you some kind of hero? I met her stare without blinking. No, it makes me the rightful owner of my own life. Peter pushed a hand through his hair, pacing once before stopping at the mantel. Rachel, is this true? Her mouth opened, then closed. She reached for a defense that didn't come. The silence was answer enough. Emily set the flash drive in the middle of the table. You both should know. If anything happens to this evidence, there are more copies in safe places. I'll make sure of it. Peter looked at me. So what now? You gonna press charges? I let the question hang. What I do next, I said slowly, depends on whether you keep your distance from my accounts, my property, and my life. Permanently. Rachel scoffed. You can't tell us? I can. I said, cutting her off, my tone like a locked door. And I am. Peter's shoulders sagged. Fine. We're done. I stood, sliding the documents back into the folder. Good, because the next time you try to meet with a banker behind my back, or forge my name, you won't just be explaining yourself to me, you'll be explaining it in court. Emily rose too, stepping between me and the coffee table like a quiet guard. Come on, Grandma, let's go. As we walked toward the door, Rachel muttered something under her breath. I didn't ask her to repeat it. She'd said enough over the past months to fill a book. Outside, the air felt cooler, sharper, like the moment after a storm passes and the sky hasn't quite decided whether to clear. Emily unlocked the car, but I paused, looking back at the house. Curtains shifted in the living room window. Rachel still watching. She's not going to let this go, Emily said. I don't need her to, I replied. I just need her to understand that I'm not the easy mark she thought I was. We drove away without speaking. My hands rested in my lap, the leather case beside me. For the first time in months, the knot between my shoulders eased. Justice didn't always come with a gavel or a headline. Sometimes it came in the form of a closed folder, a turned back, and a door that would never open the same way again. The days after that meeting felt lighter, but not quiet. Word traveled through the family faster than I could have imagined. A cousin I hadn't heard from in years called to check in. I could hear the curiosity in her voice, the way she circled every question without landing on it. I didn't bother explaining. Let them wonder. Peter didn't call. Rachel didn't text. It was the kind of silence that hums, the sound of people regrouping after a failed attack. I knew they were talking behind closed doors, rewriting the story so they came out the heroes. That was fine. My truth was in writing, sealed, copied, and waiting. Emily came by every other day, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with just her steady presence. She'd sit at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, while I watered the plants or sorted mail. We didn't talk about the meeting unless she brought it up. They're embarrassed, she said one afternoon, folding her hands. Rachel's been avoiding the rest of the family. Good, I replied. Let her avoid me, too. The absence of their drama left space I didn't realize I'd been missing. I took longer walks in the morning, pausing to chat with neighbors. I started cooking for myself again, not just heating something quick, but making real meals. The smell of rosemary chicken or fresh bread filled the house in a way it hadn't since Tom passed. One morning, I found myself pulling out an old box from the attic. Inside were photo albums, letters, and small mementos from trips Tom and I had taken. Dust coated everything, but underneath, the colors were still reach. Postcards from Maine, a pressed flower from our anniversary in Savannah. I spent hours sitting cross-legged on the floor, letting the past wash over me, not as a wound but as something warm. In the evenings, I'd sit on the porch and watch the street. The world moved on. Kids rode bikes, dogs barked, mail was delivered. Life was quieter without the constant need to defend my place in my own family. Emily noticed it too. You're smiling more, she said one night, handing me a cup of tea. I'm remembering who I was before I let them decide for me, I said. It feels like breathing again. The phone rang a few times that week. I let the machine pick up. Rachel's voice came through once, clipped and formal, asking for conversation to clear misunderstandings. I didn't return the call. Some doors stay closed for a reason. By the second week, the distance between us had settled into something permanent. No angry confrontations, no sudden visits, just an absence that felt more like relief than loss. I spent my mornings tending the garden. The tulip bulbs I'd planted months ago had started to push green shoots through the soil. Watching them emerge reminded me that growth can happen quietly, underground long before anyone sees the bloom. Emily helped me clear the spare room, stacking boxes in the corner. What's all this for? She asked. I'm thinking of turning it into a reading room, I said. Something I've always wanted. She smiled. That sounds perfect. In the afternoons, I sorted through more of Tom's things. His fishing gear, the old toolbox he kept in the garage, the leather-bound journal where he'd written ideas for our retirement. I kept what mattered and donated the rest. It felt like making space, not just in the house but in my own mind. One rainy evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the leather case still in reach. The evidence was no longer a weapon I needed to brandish. It was insurance, tucked away but ready if the past tried to claw its way back. The phone rang again. This time, Peter's voice filled the machine. Mom, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how things went. I need time. We'll talk soon. I didn't erase it. I also didn't call back. Forgiveness, I'd learned, didn't have to mean re-entry. Emily and I began making small plans, day trips to the coast, visits to the farmer's market, simple things that reminded me the world was bigger than one family's betrayal. On a Sunday morning, I took a long walk through the neighborhood. Passing by the park, I saw Rachel in the distance talking to another woman. She spotted me but didn't wave. I kept walking, my pace steady, my gaze forward. There was no need to stop. Back home, I made tea and sat by the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the world smelling fresh and clean. I thought about the months behind me, how close I'd come to losing everything, and how I'd taken it back without shouting, without breaking myself in the process. Justice had been served in the quietest way possible. Now, what remained was mine to shape, and for the first time in a long while, I was ready to shape it. The lake was still when I first saw it that morning, glass clear, holding the pale blue of the spring sky. I stood on the deck of the small cabin I'd rented for the week, the air cool against my cheeks. This was my place now. Not the cabin itself, but the feeling it gave me, space, silence, and the promise of starting again. I'd sold a small plot of land Tom and I had bought years ago for someday. The proceeds covered this trip, the repairs I wanted to make at home, and a little more for the future. For the first time in months, I spent money without that tight knot of fear in my stomach. Emily arrived the next day, suitcase in hand, grinning like a kid. "I can't believe you did this," she said, looking around at the cabin's wood, paneled walls, and the shelf lined with books I'd already stocked. "This is just the start," I told her. "I'm thinking about opening a little reading room back home, a place for anyone who needs somewhere to go when life turns sharp." We spent our days walking the trails, sitting on the porch with coffee, and reading in companionable silence. At night, we'd cook together. Nothing fancy, just pasta, soups, fresh bread from the local bakery. One evening, as we watched the sun sink behind the trees, Emily asked, "Do you think you'll ever let them back in? Peter and Rachel?" I thought about it. If they come with honesty, maybe. But I won't wait for that to happen. My life can't be on pause for people who don't value it. The lake held the last of the sunlight, gold turning to silver. I felt steady, rooted. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. By the end of the week at the lake, the plan for my reading room had taken shape. Emily sketched layouts on a notepad, comfortable chairs by the windows, low shelves so sunlight could pour in, a corner with a kettle and mugs for tea. We talked about hosting story nights, letting people share pieces of their lives the way I had finally shared mine. Back home, I moved quickly. The spare room was cleared within days, painted a warm cream, and filled with the books I'd collected over decades. Emily brought over a small rug she'd found at a thrift store, and we hung Tom's framed map of the world on the far wall. It felt right, like his quiet blessing on this new chapter. Neighbors started to notice. Mrs. Harris from down the street stopped by with a tin of cookies. "I heard you're opening your door," she said. "That's a rare thing these days." "I'm opening it for the right reasons," I told her. One Saturday, I hosted the first gathering. Just 5 people, Emily, Mrs. Harris, 2 young mothers from the block, and a retired teacher named Ben. We sat in a loose circle, mugs in hand, and I told them the story, not every detail, but enough to make the point, about boundaries, about quiet justice, about how life after betrayal can still be rich. When I finished, there was a silence, not awkward but full. Then Ben nodded slowly. "You turned the ending into a beginning," he said. That night, after everyone left, I stood in the center of the room and looked around. The walls held more than books now. They held the start of my legacy. Not the money I'd protected or the property I'd saved, but the choice to live on my own terms and help others do the same. Emily hugged me before she left. "You know, Grandma, you're the strongest person I know." I smiled. "Strength isn't loud, dear. It's just steady." As the door closed behind her, I realized the true justice I'd found wasn't in proving Rachel and Peter wrong. It was in proving to myself that I could reclaim my life, protect it, and still leave room for something beautiful to grow. Outside, the night was clear, the stars sharp in the cold air. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and felt, finally, at home.